"We wish Mike was our only child," my dad said at dinner while everyone nodded. I just smiled and said, "Then I'll make that happen." That one sentence set in motion a plan 6 months in the making. They thought my success was their resource to drain, but they were about to learn that the quiet daughter they ignored was the only thing holding their entire world together. This is where the story truly begins, and you won't want to miss what happens. Make sure you're subscribed to see it through to the end. We're always curious. Where in the world are you all watching from today? Let us know in the comments. The heavy, antique-smelling air of my parents' dining room always made me feel small. It was the same room I'd presented Strata report cards in, only to be met with a distracted, "That's nice, dear," while my brother Mike was praised for scoring a single goal in his soccer game. Tonight, the air was thicker, heavier. I was seated at the far end of the table, a ghost at my own family's feast. I was running on fumes, recovering from a brutal 3-month project that had nearly sent me to the hospital for exhaustion. As a software architect, I lived in a world of logic, code, and complex systems, and I had just led a team to launch a platform that was already making headlines in the tech world. I was tired, my bones ached, and I was emotionally fragile, hoping for just one evening of simple, quiet family connection. My brother, Mike, was holding court. At 30, he still had the boyish charm that had always made him the center of their universe. He was gesturing wildly, describing his latest venture, some app that promised to revolutionize the dog-walking industry. I'd heard it all before. His pitches were always grand, his business plans tissue-thin. "And that," Mike said, raising his wine glass, "is how you build an empire." My father, Richard, beamed. His pride was so bright it was almost blinding. "That's my boy, a real empire builder, not like some people who just, sit behind a computer all day." I felt the familiar, dull sting. I glanced at my mother, Susan, who was watching Mike with adoring eyes, completely oblivious to the barb. I chose to stay silent, picking at the roast beef on my plate. I was the one who had not only paid for the wine Mike was drinking, but also for the roof over all their heads. This house, the one my father acted as lord of the manor in, was purchased by my LLC. The investments into Mike's string of failed empires came directly from a trust fund I'd established and personally funded for the family's use. They knew I was successful, but they preferred to frame it as me having a good little job, while Mike was the visionary. "He just has that spark, doesn't he?" my mother chimed in. "Everything he touches, it just feels important." Richard laughed, a hearty, booming sound that set my teeth on edge. He leaned back in his chair, patting his stomach. "It's true, he's a chip off the old block, he thinks big." He then looked down the table at me, his gaze dismissive. "Alina, you're awfully quiet, tired from all that?" "Typing." Mike snickered. "Easy, Dad, we can't all be visionaries." I felt a coldness settle over me, a strange, clarifying calm. The exhaustion, the years of being overlooked, the constant, casual disrespect, it all coalesced into a single point of sharp, painful clarity. Richard then turned to the table, which included my aunt and uncle, who always nodded along. He said, his voice full of false, jovial sincerity, "Susan and I were just saying the other day, we wish Mike was our only child." The words hung in the air, sucking all the oxygen out of the room. My aunt and uncle nodded, as if this was the most reasonable statement in the world. My mother smiled, a soft, complicit expression. Mike looked smug, soaking in the affirmation. No one looked at me. It was as if I wasn't even there, the ghost at the feast. I watched them for a long moment. I saw them for exactly what they were, not as the family I'd been desperately trying to earn the love of, but as they truly were. My father, a man living in a house he didn't own, funded by a daughter he held in contempt. My brother, a parasite disguised as a golden child. My mother, a woman so committed to the family narrative that she would watch her daughter be emotionally executed at the dinner table and say nothing. I placed my napkin neatly on the table. The room went quiet, finally noticing I had moved. I smiled. It wasn't a sad smile. It wasn't angry. It was the calm, placid smile of a system administrator who had just located a catastrophic error in the code. "Then I'll make that happen," I said, my voice even and light. My father blinked, confused. "What's that, dear?" "I'll make that happen for you, Dad," I repeated, standing up. "I'll make it so Mike is your only child." The confusion on their faces was palpable. They were expecting tears, a scene, a retreat. I weren't prepared for quiet agreement. "Elena, don't be dramatic," my mother said, finally sensing a shift in the power dynamic. "I'm not," I said, picking up my purse. "I'm just obliging. It's a reasonable request." I looked at each of them, my gaze lingering for just a second. "Thank you for dinner. It was very illuminating." I walked out of the dining room, my footsteps the only sound in the house. As I opened the front door, I heard my father call out, his voice annoyed. "Well, what's gotten into her?" I closed the door behind me, the solid thud feeling like the final line of code being compiled. As I walked to my car, the cold night air felt like a baptism. The plan was already forming in my mind, a complex algorithm of disentanglement. They had forgotten who I was. They had forgotten that the person who sits quietly behind the computer is the one who builds the systems, owns the architecture, and holds all the keys. The betrayal was worse than any burnout I had ever experienced, but it was also the cure. I drove home in silence, the 20-minute trip feeling like a journey across a newly formed continent. My apartment, a clean, minimalist space that I owned outright, felt like a sanctuary. It was the one part of my life they hadn't touched, hadn't infiltrated with their expectations and passive-aggressive demands. I made a cup of tea, my hands perfectly steady. There were no tears, no storm of rage. Instead, I felt a profound, almost unnerving stillness. The problem had been identified. Now, it was time to architect the solution. For the next 2 days, my phone was silent. No calls from my mother demanding I apologize for my dramatic exit. No texts from my father telling me to stop being sensitive. No entitled messages from Mike about his next brilliant idea. Their silence was their answer. In their minds, I was the one who had misbehaved. I was the one who needed to come crawling back, repentant, to resume my role as the family's silent benefactor and designated scapegoat. On the third day, the phone finally rang. It was my mother. I let it ring 4 times before picking up. "Elena," she said, her voice clipped. "No hello, no how are you?" "Hi, Mom," I said, my tone neutral. There was a sigh, heavy and put upon. "Elena, your father is very upset. You really embarrassed him in front of your aunt and uncle. You know how he is." "I know exactly how he is," I said, sipping my tea. "Well, you can't just say things like that. You know he didn't mean it." "He said it," I replied, and everyone nodded. "You nodded, Mom." She sputtered, a noise of indignation. "I was just trying to keep the peace. You know Mike is in a delicate place with his new business, and your father is so proud. You could have just let it go." "I did let it go," I said. "I let it all go." "Good," she said, completely missing the meaning. She cleared her throat, and I knew instinctively that the real reason for her call was about to surface. The pleasantries were over. "Listen, honey," she began, her voice shifting into that wheedling tone I'd come to despise. "I was just looking at the calendar, and Mike's rent for his office space is due at the end of the week. You haven't, transferred the funds for the family account yet." I stared at the wall. The family account was the trust I'd set up, the one I funded with a generous 6-figure deposit every quarter. It paid for the mortgage on their house, the house my LLC owned, though they conveniently forgot that. It paid for their cars, it paid for Mike's apartment, and it paid for the commercial lease on whatever headquarters he was pretending to run. "I know," I said. "Well, are you going to?" she asked, a new edge of panic in her voice. "He needs it, Elena, this new venture. It could be the one." "I'm not sure," I said. "What do you mean you're not sure?" Her voice was rising, losing its soft, motherly facade and revealing the sharp, grasping anxiety beneath. "It's the family money. You can't just not pay it." "It's not family money, Mom. It's my money," I said, the words landing with the simple, undeniable weight of truth. It's money I earn from the typing job Dad finds so unimpressive. Elena, this is not the time for your little rebellion, she hissed. Your brother is counting on that. You can't just pull the rug out from under him, from under all of us, your father. He won't stand for it. He doesn't have to, I said. He won't even have to stand at all. The house he's standing in is paid for by me. The ground beneath his feet is owned by me. There was a sharp intake of breath. How dare you, after everything we've done for you? I cut her off. No, after everything I've done for you, and I'm done. You'll regret this, she shrieked. You'll come crawling back and I won't, I said, and I hung up the phone. I sat there as the adrenaline began to fade, replaced by that same cold, clear calm. Is was the first test, and I had passed. They didn't see me as a daughter, they saw me as a resource. An uncooperative ATM. My mother hadn't called to apologize for the most deeply cutting remark of my life. She had called because a payment was late. I opened my laptop, the screen illuminating my face in the dim room. My fingers flew across the keyboard, logging into my secure legal and financial portals. The architecture I had built was complex, with firewalls and redundancies designed to protect my assets. I'd built it years ago, not because I'd anticipated this exact scenario, but because my architect's mind demanded order and security. They thought I was just an emotional girl having a tantrum. They thought they could pressure me, bully me, and shame me back into line. They believed they held all the power of family, of guilt, of parental authority. But they had forgotten one crucial thing. They had forgotten that in the 21st century, the person who writes the code, owns the servers, and controls the data doesn't just have a seat at the table. They own the table and the house it's in. My family's narrative about me was simple and, in their eyes, convenient. Elena was the stable one, the practical one. I was the boring, quiet cog that kept the exciting machine running. The machine, of course, was my brother Mike. This dynamic had been cemented when I was 19. I was in my second year of college, drowning in advanced computer science theory. While Mike, then 16, was the high school football hero, I was spending my nights coding. I built an application, a niche but incredibly effective data sorting algorithm for logistics companies. I sold it to a mid-level shipping firm for a sum that, to my 19-year-old self, felt like all the money in the world. It was a life-changing amount. My first act was not to buy a sports car or a lavish apartment. It was to buy my parents a house. They had been renting a cramped, run-down house, and my father, Richard, was always complaining about his bad luck in the job market. He'd been consulting for as long as I could remember, a vague title that seemed to involve a lot of golf and very few clients. I saw the sale as a way to finally give them security, to finally earn that deep, resounding pride I'd always craved. I set up an LLC and purchased a beautiful 4-bedroom house in a nice neighborhood. I presented it to them, and they were, for a time, ecstatic. But the narrative quickly shifted. It wasn't Elena bought us a house. It became, we finally got the house we deserved. My contribution was downgraded to a helping hand. As my career took off, escalating from coder to senior developer to architect at a top-tier firm, my income grew exponentially. I set up the Family and Ventures Trust, as I'd charitably named it. This was the account I funded, the one that paid the property taxes and utilities on their house, their car leases, their club memberships. And most significantly, it became the endless well from which Mike drew his seed money. My father was the architect of this family mythology. Richard was a man who exuded an air of old-world authority, all polished shoes and firm handshakes. He talked a big game about legacy and building something, but he had never, to my knowledge, built anything at all. He saw my success not as my own, but as a resource that belonged to the family to be distributed by him, the patriarch. He'd sit at the head of the dinner table, my dinner table, in my house, and pontificate. Elena's job is fine, he'd say to friends. Good benefits. Stable, but Mike's the one with the vision. He's the one who's going to put the family name on the map. My typing job was a source of private amusement for him, something nerdy and insubstantial. He didn't understand what I did, and he had no interest in learning. I could have told him that the typing I did was currently powering the entire backend of one of the nation's largest e-commerce platforms, but he wouldn't have understood. It was easier to see me as the dutiful daughter with a high-paying, unglamorous job. Mike, in contrast, was all flash. His ventures were always flashy: a subscription box for artisanal jerky, a bespoke sneaker cleaning service, and now the dog-walking app. They all had one thing in common: they were terribly run and hemorrhaged money. My money. The dynamic was this: Mike would have an idea, my father would declare it genius, and I would receive a call from my mother about investing in Mike's future. My attempts to introduce business plans, to ask for metrics or projections, were met with offense. "Elena, this is family," my father would say, his voice full of disappointment. "We don't treat family like a bank. This is about belief." But that's exactly what they treated me as: a bank, an invisible, unfeeling, infinitely replenishable bank. My mother, Susan, was the emotional enforcer. She was the one who would call me, crying about how stressed my father was, or how Mike was on the verge of a breakthrough if only he had a little more capital. She wielded guilt like a surgeon's scalpel, precisely and devastatingly. This entire ecosystem, this house of cards built on my labor and their entitlement, was what I was up against. They hadn't just insulted me, they had fundamentally misunderstood the power dynamic of the last 15 years. They saw me as a supporting character in the Mike show. They had forgotten that I was the executive producer, the writer, and the entire studio. And I was canceling the show. My call to my mother was the first domino. Now, it was time to push the next one. The rage I'd expected to feel had been replaced by a quiet, focused resolve. This wasn't an emotional outburst. This was a system decommission. The morning after the call with my mother, the fog of exhaustion and emotional shock finally lifted. It was replaced by the familiar, electric hum of a problem that needed solving. I was no longer a hurt daughter. I was an architect, and the system I was analyzing was my own life. It had critical vulnerabilities that had been exploited for years. It was time for a patch. My first call was to Ben Carter, my lawyer. Ben was a sharp, no-nonsense corporate attorney who had helped me structure my LLC and the trust fund years ago. He had, at the time, raised an eyebrow at the one-sided nature of the trust. "Ben, it's Elena," I said, pacing my living room. "Elena, I saw the launch metrics for your new platform. Congratulations. You're going to make a lot of people very rich." "Thanks, Ben. I need to talk to you about another system, the Family and Ventures Trust." There was a pause. What's the crisis?" "The beneficiaries have begun to confuse the administrator with the assets," I said. "It's time for a full security audit and a controlled shutdown." Ben let out a low whistle. "Understood. Where do we start?" "We start with the assets. First, the house on Willow Creek." "The one your LLC owns and your parents reside in," he confirmed. "That's the one. I want to begin the formal eviction process. Give them the legal minimum. 60 days. "That's aggressive, Elena. Are you sure?" "They just informed me they wish I didn't exist. I'm sure." "All right," Ben said, his voice all business. "I'll have the notice drawn up and delivered by a courier by end of day. What's next?" "The trust. I am the sole trustee and the sole contributor, correct?" "Correct. You have absolute authority to dissolve it, freeze it, or set it on fire and throw it in a dumpster." "For now, just freeze it," I said. "Freeze all accounts. No more payments, no more transfers. I want to block the auto draft for the car leases, and specifically, the commercial lease for Mike's Doggy Dash, or whatever it's called this week." "Done," Ben said. "That brings me to the third item, Mike's Ventures. You've invested, and I use that term loosely, a significant amount of capital over the years." "That's my investigation," I said. "I want you to commission a full forensic audit of every dollar I've put into Mike's last 3 businesses. I have the incorporation papers. He made me a silent partner in each, though I've never seen a dime in returns." I know just the person, Ben said. She's a shark, she'll find everything. What's the end game, Alina? Are you planning to sue him? The end game is leverage, I said. The clever trap isn't just that I own everything, it's that I have the receipts for everything they've wasted. I'm not just taking back my property, I'm taking back my power. The rest of the week was a blur of execution. The eviction notice was delivered. The trust was frozen. The auditor began her work. The silence from my family was deafening. It was the silence of disbelief, of people who have pushed a button their entire lives, and for the first time, it didn't work. They were probably huddled together, confused, angry, and still, I was sure, blaming me for overreacting. The turning point came exactly 4 days later. My phone lit up with a name I hadn't seen in a week, Mike. I let it ring, then answered, putting it on speaker. Alina, what the hell is going on? He yelled. No hello, just pure, unfiltered panic. Hello, Mike. What specifically are you referring to? My office, he shouted. The lease payment, it bounced, they're threatening to lock me out, and my corporate card was declined. What did you do? I didn't do anything, Mike, I said calmly. Or rather, I stopped doing something. I stopped funding the trust. What? You can't do that, that's our money, Dad said. Dad was wrong, I interrupted. It's my money, and I'm no longer investing in your businesses. My businesses? His voice was incredulous. This is my life, you're ruining me, you're just jealous, that's what it is. You've always been jealous of me and Dad. I almost laughed. Jealous? Mike, I've been funding your entire life for a decade. The only thing I'm jealous of is your profound, astronomical audacity. You can't do this, he sputtered. I'll sue you, we'll take you to court. Dad's already talking to a lawyer. Are you? I said. That's interesting. I've been talking to my lawyer too. And you should probably check the signature on that commercial lease you're so worried about, Mike. It's not yours, it's mine. My LLC is the leaseholder. And the lease just happens to expire in 30 days. I've already given the property manager our notice of non-renewal. So you're not just late on rent, Mike, you're out. There was a strangled sound on the other end of the line. I heard fumbling, and then my father's voice, booming and furious, came on. Alina, you stop this right now. You stop this madness. It's not madness, Dad. It's a simple consequence. You are going to turn that account back on. You are going to pay your brother's lease. You are not going to throw your family out on the street. I will not be humiliated by my own daughter. Humiliation is an interesting choice of words, I said, my voice as cold as steel. You seemed fine with humiliating me at dinner last week. You wished I wasn't your child. You're getting your wish, with all the financial and legal consequences that entails. We will fight you, he roared. We'll see you in court. You can't just take everything. Here's the problem, Dad, I said, walking to my window and looking out at the city. You can't take what was never yours. You're all about to learn a very hard, very expensive lesson in basic ownership. I hung up the phone. The war had begun, but I was the only one with an army. The first volley had been fired. My father's threat of a lawsuit was laughable. Ben confirmed as much in a brief, almost comical email. The LLCs and trust were ironclad. I was the sole officer, the sole trustee, the sole benefactor. They had no legal standing whatsoever. They were, in legal terms, tenants in a house and beneficiaries of a private, discretionary trust that I had, at my discretion, chosen to stop funding. Their panic, however, was just beginning. A few days later, my mother called. This time, there was no pretense, no false pleasantries. She was crying real, hysterical sobs. Alina, please, she wept. They're repossessing the cars, the bank called, the lease payment. It's been 3 weeks, your father. He's a mess, Alina. He can't even leave the house. He'll have to leave the house anyway in about 50 days, Mom, I said, my voice flat. I was tired of the emotional manipulation. The eviction notice, she whispered, as if saying it aloud made it real. We thought that was a joke, Alina, a cruel, cruel joke. You wouldn't really kick your own parents out. You and Dad seem to have a very clear idea of what a child should or shouldn't do, I said. I'm just following your new family model. Mike is your only child. I'm just a former business associate. How can you be so cold? She cried. We're your family. You were my family when you all nodded as Dad wished I didn't exist. Were you my family when you called me, not to see if I was okay, but to demand I pay for Mike's office? You can't have it both ways, Mom. You can't treat me like a stranger, like an ATM, and then appeal to me as a daughter. It doesn't work. The logic is flawed. I heard my father grab the phone. You think you're so smart with your logic, he yelled. You've always been a cold, unfeeling girl, just like a machine. You have no heart, Alina. A machine, I said. You're right, I am. I'm the machine you all built. I'm the machine that worked 80-hour weeks to fund your lifestyles. I'm the machine that processed your insults and your ingratitude and still spat out money. But this machine is offline. Permanently. I hung up. I knew this was far from over. They were wounded, cornered, and, worst of all, deeply humiliated. My father's entire identity was built on being the successful patriarch. I hadn't just cut off his money, I had cut off his sense of self. The next confrontation happened a week later. The auditor's preliminary report had come in, and it was devastating. Ben had arranged a meeting at his office. I requested, strongly, that Mike be there. I had a feeling he wouldn't come, so I sent him a small, enticing text. If you want to discuss a potential severance package, be at my lawyer's office tomorrow at 10 a.m. He was there 5 minutes early, wearing a suit I'd probably paid for. He looked thin, stressed, and angry. Okay, Alina, he said as I walked into the conference room. Ben sat at the head of the table. This is ridiculous. You've made your point. You're ruining us. What do you want? I want to go over your severance package, I said, sitting down across from him. Ben, the floor is yours. Ben opened a file. Mr. Last Name, he said, we've conducted a preliminary audit of the last 3 entities you founded, starting with Artisan Jerky Co-op. Mike paled. What audit? My audit, I said. As the primary investor and 50% silent partner in all 3 ventures, I'm entitled to one. Ben slid a summary sheet across the table. What we found, Mike, is not just a series of failed businesses. What we found is a consistent, multi-year pattern of what looks, to my professional eye, very much like wire fraud. Mike's jaw dropped. Fraud, what are you? That's slander. Is it? Ben said, his voice silky smooth. Let's look at Mike's doggy dash. You submitted an investor's report to Alina Well, to her family office, requesting $80,000 for app development and server scaling. But our auditor found that the app was a $500 template you bought online. The server scaling was a $50 a month web hosting plan, the other $74,500. He tapped a second sheet. We found receipts for a luxury car lease, a vacation to Ibiza, and 3 designer watches. Mike looked like he was going to be sick. He looked at me, his eyes wide with panic. Alina, it was startup expenses, building the brand. Building the brand? I repeated, my voice quiet. You stole from me, Mike. You didn't just fail. You actively, deliberately stole from me. You stole from your own sister, who was working herself into the ground so you could go to Ibiza. He stammered, his bravado completely gone, replaced by the terrified child he'd always been. Dad said it was fine. He said the money was just. He said you wouldn't even notice. It was just family money. There it is again, I said. Family money. I leaned forward. There is no family money, Mike. There is only my money, and you've committed multiple felonies with it. He started to break down, his face crumbling. Alina, please. You can't send me to jail. Please, I'll pay it back. I'll do anything. There's your severance package, Mike, I said, standing up. My silence. I'm not going to press charges. I'm not going to sue you for the $500,000 you've stolen from me over the last 10 years. My package to you is my absence. I am walking away, and I am taking my houses, my cars, and my money with me. You are free, Mike. free to go get a real job and build a real life without me there to ruin it for you. I turned to Ben. Ben, if you'll give my brother the full audit report, I'm sure he and Dad's lawyer will find it fascinating reading. I walked out of the room, leaving him sobbing at the conference table. The first major confrontation was over. I hadn't just shattered his perception, I'd shattered the entire illusion his life was built on. The golden child was, in fact, a common thief, and now he knew that I knew. The reveal of the audit sent a shockwave through the family. Mike, in his terror, must have confessed everything to our parents. The dynamic shifted instantly. The angry, indignant phone calls stopped. They were replaced by a new, more desperate tactic, a full-blown smear campaign. My father, Richard, went into overdrive. He began calling extended family, painting me as a cold, vindictive monster. I heard from my aunt, the same one who had nodded at the dinner table, who called to tell me she was deeply disappointed in me. "Your father is a proud man, Alina," she said, her voice dripping with judgment. "And you've taken everything from him. He's broken, and your brother. He's a good boy, he just made some mistakes. Family is supposed to forgive. Family is also not supposed to wish one of their members non-existent, Aunt Carol," I retorted. "And mistakes is a very generous word for grand larceny. You were at the dinner. You nodded. So, with all due respect, your opinion on my family's dynamics is not something I value." I hung up. But their desperation was escalating. My mother, Susan, was still struggling, caught between her snake of a husband and her fraudster son. She was the one still in the house with Richard, listening to his rages, watching their world dissolve. She tried a different approach. She showed up at my apartment unannounced. I opened the door to find her standing in the hallway, looking smaller and older than I'd ever seen her. "Alina," she said, her voice trembling, "please let me in, let's just talk." I hesitated, then stepped aside. She walked into my clean, quiet apartment and looked around, as if seeing it for the first time. "This is very nice," she said. "What do you want, Moms?" She sat on the edge of my sofa. "Your father, he's not himself, he's talking about how his life is over. He's saying terrible things. This is destroying him, Alina." "He destroyed this," I said, remaining standing. "He built this entire family on a lie, that Mike was the future and I was the utility. He taught Mike that my work, my money, was his to ta. He celebrated it. The only thing that's changed is that I'm no longer paying for the lie." "But it's not a lie," she insisted, her denial still powerful. "Mike, he's not good with details, he has the ideas, he has the vision, you were supposed to be the support." "I was not support, Mom, I was the source, and the source is dry." "Please, Alina," she begged, the tears coming now, just the house, let us keep the house. We'll pay rent, your father can. He can get a real job." The words pay rent and real job sounded so foreign, so absurd coming from her mouth that I almost laughed. "He's 61, Mom, and the house is worth over $1 million. The mortgage, which I pay, is $5,000 a month. The taxes are another $2,000. Can he get a job that will support that?" She crumpled. "We have nowhere to go, we have no money, the accounts, they're all empty, you've left us with nothing." "I left you with exactly what you had before I started my career," I corrected her. "You are in the same position you would be in if I had, as Dad wished, never existed. This is the reality you asked for." "You're a monster," she whispered, the tears stopping, replaced by a cold hatred. "A cold, unfeeling monster. You're no daughter of mine." "That's the second time my parentage has been revoked in a month," I said, opening the door. "I think I've finally gotten the message. Goodbye, Mom." She stormed out, and as I closed the door, I knew the final confrontation was coming. They had tried anger, they had tried guilt, they had tried shaming. They had failed. The final piece of the case arrived 2 days later. The full, bound audit report. It was worse than I thought. Mike hadn't just been stealing. He had, on 2 occasions, forged my digital signature on loan applications, using my name and my assets as collateral. He had committed identity theft. Ben was clear. This is no longer a family squabble, Elena. This is a multi-year, felony-level crime. Your brother could go to prison for a very long time. I held the report in my hands. This was it. This was the irrefutable proof. This was the key that would either lock him away or, perhaps, unlock a final, devastating truth. My family was still in denial, still trying to paint me as the villain. They needed to see. They needed to understand. They had pushed me from victim to strategist. Now, they were pushing me from strategist to executioner. The only question was what form that execution would take. The final showdown was set, not by me, but by my father. With the eviction date looming, less than 2 weeks away, he made one last, desperate, pathetic move. He called for a family meeting, a term that in our family meant a tribunal. He summoned the extended family, Aunt Carol, Uncle David, and a few others, to the house on Willow Creek. It was a public shaming, designed to corner me, to use the full weight of family judgment to force me to capitulate. He sent me a text. We are all meeting at the house on Sunday at 3 p.m. Be there. It's time to end this. I replied with one word, okay. I arrived at 3 p.m. on the dot. I wasn't the fragile, exhausted woman who had walked out of this house 6 months ago. I was clear-eyed, rested, and armed. I was wearing a sharp, well-tailored blazer, and I was carrying a briefcase. In it was the bound audit report and a copy of the eviction order. I walked into the living room. It was the same room they'd all nodded in. My father sat in his high-backed chair like a king holding a failing court. My mother was beside him, red-eyed and trembling. Mike was there, standing by the fireplace, looking hollowed out. Aunt Carol and Uncle David sat on the sofa, their faces set in grim, judgmental lines. Elena, my father began, his voice attempting a tone of magnanimous, wounded authority. Thank you for coming. We are all here, as a family, because we are deeply, deeply concerned about you. I almost smiled, concerned about me. This campaign against us, he jested vaguely. This cruelty, it's not you, Elena. You've let your success poison you. You're throwing your own family out on the street. Your mother and I, we have nowhere to go. Your brother, you've ruined him. He's a good boy, Aunt Carol murmured. All boys make mistakes. I stood in the center of the room, letting them all have their say. I let the weight of their judgment fill the space. Are you finished? I asked, my voice cutting through the heavy silence. My father, thrown off, just stared at me. Good. I placed my briefcase on the coffee table and clicked it open. Let's clear up a few of your concerns. First, this isn't a campaign. It's a legal disentanglement. You call it cruelty. I call it a consequence. You wished I was not your child. I have obliged. You are now simply people I used to know. I turned to my aunt and uncle. And you, I said, my voice sharp, you're rye. GHT, Aunt Carol. I have been poisoned. I was poisoned for 34 years by a family that taught me that my only value was what I could provide. I was poisoned by the belief that if I just worked harder, if I just gave more, I would finally be enough. But I was never enough. I was just useful. I looked at Mike. You, I said, are not a good boy who made mistakes. You are a 30-year-old man who committed fraud. I took the audit report from my briefcase and threw it on the table. It landed with a heavy, definitive thud. What is that? My father demanded. That, I said, is a full forensic audit of the last 10 years of investment into Mike. That is proof of wire fraud. That is proof of grand larceny. That is proof, and my voice dropped, of identity theft and forgery. That is proof that your golden child didn't just make mistakes. He's a criminal. He forged my name on loan applications. He used my assets to secure funding for trips to Ibiza and luxury cars, all while telling me his business was failing. Aunt Carol gasped. My father's face went from red to a sickly, mottled white. Mike just stared at the report as if it were a bomb. You're lying. My father stammered, but his voice had no conviction. Am I? I turned to Mike. Go on, Mike. Tell them it's a lie. Tell them you didn't steal $500,000 from me. Tell them you didn't forge my signature. Go on. Mike looked at me, his eyes wide with pure, unadulterated terror. He looked at our father. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He was trapped. And in that moment, he broke. He told me too. Mike suddenly screamed, pointing a shaking finger at our father. He told me to, he said it was fine, he said, she'll never even know, it's just money, she has plenty. He helped me do the loan applications. He said it was smart financing. The room imploded. My mother let out a high-pitched wail. My aunt and uncle looked at my father, their expressions of judgment now turning to ones of pure horror and disgust. My father, Richard, he just, deflated, the king was dead. The bravado, the arrogance, the authority, it all drained out of him, leaving a small, pathetic, terrified old man in a chair he no longer owned. He had been exposed, not just as a bully, but as a co-conspirator. A failed, jealous man who had used his own son to steal from his daughter. You, my father whispered, staring at Mike with venom, you weak, stupid boy. And you, I said, my voice ringing with finality, are a thief, Dad. You're just a common, pathetic thief who was so jealous of his daughter's success that he'd rather tear her down and steal from her than ever once just say, congratulations. I picked up the copy of the eviction notice and placed it neatly on top of the audit report. The eviction stands, I said to the stunned room. You have 13 days to vacate my property. If you are not out by then, I will have the sheriff remove you. I turned to my mother. Mom, you can come with me, right now, you can leave him, I will set you up in an apartment, I will take care of you, but if you stay with him, you are part of this, you are choosing this. My mother looked at my father, this small, broken man. She looked at Mike, who was sobbing in the corner. Then she looked at me, her eyes full of a new, different kind of hatred. A hatred for the person who had forced the choice. Get out, she whispered, get out of my house. It's not your house, Mom, I said, my voice softer now, tinged with a deep, profound sadness. It never was. I zipped up my briefcase and walked out of the room. I left them all there, in the ruins of the family they had built, the silence behind me heavier and more final than any explosion. The downfall was not a dramatic, fiery crash. It was a slow, quiet, inevitable collapse. The 13 days passed. On the 14th day, as promised, the sheriff's deputies arrived at the house on Willow Creek. My parents were not there. They had, in the dead of night, moved out, leaving the house in a state of disarray, furniture overturned, trash on the carpets. It was a final, petty act of defiance. It cost me a significant amount to have it cleaned, but it was the last check I would ever write for them. I put the house on the market. It sold in a week. Richard and Susan, as I learned later from my aunt, moved into a small, one-bedroom rental apartment an hour away. The shock of their new reality was profound. My father, stripped of his status, his fine house, and his club memberships, fell into a deep, silent depression. My mother was forced to get a job for the first time in 30 years as a cashier at a local grocery store, just to make ends meet. Mike, terrified of prosecution, disappeared. He left town, moving somewhere out west, and cut off all contact with the family. The threat of the audit, the irrefutable proof of his crim. Ease was leverage I never had to use. It was enough that he knew it existed. He would spend the rest of his life looking over his shoulder, and that, I decided, was justice enough. The extended family, once my father's loyal chorus, fell silent. They had seen the truth, and the shame of it was total. Aunt Carol sent me one short email. I am so very sorry, Alina, we never knew. I didn't reply. For me, life became quiet. The constant, low-level thrum of my family's demands and disappointments, a noise I had lived with for so long I hadn't even noticed it, was finally gone. I went to work. I saw my friends. I traveled. I poured the money I had once funneled into the family trust into things that mattered. I founded and funded the Alina Last Name Scholarship for Women in STEM, a program specifically designed to support young, brilliant women from unsupportive or difficult family backgrounds. I met the first class of recipients, 4 bright, ambitious young women with fire in their eyes, and I told them, "Your success is yours. Don't ever let anyone make you feel small for it." About a year after the showdown, I received a letter. It was from my mother. It wasn't a request for money or a demand. It was just a letter. She wrote that my father was in therapy. She wrote that her job was hard, but that for the first time in her life, the money she held in her hand felt like her own. She wrote 3 simple words that I had waited my entire life to hear. "I am so sorry. You were right." I read the letter, folded it, and put it in a drawer. It was a start. A tentative, fragile bridge across a chasm I had not created but had been forced to cross. I didn't call her. Not yet. But for the first time, I thought that maybe, one day, I might. My life was my own. I had built my systems, defended them, and then rebuilt them from the ground up. My family had wished I was not their child. I had granted that wish. And in doing so, I had finally, truly, become my own person. The house of cards had fallen, and I was at peace, standing in the quiet, solid foundation of the life I had built for myself.